Stylistic pedaling, of course, changes with the genre and the composer that you're performing. Once you're playing romantic music and later, the pedal tends to be much more specific. If it was not put in by the composer themselves, then it was put in by the student of a composer like Micheli with Chopin and Paderewski. It was put in by somebody who closely worked with Chopin and knew what he wanted pedaling wise. And the more contemporary, the rule of thumb is that it's exactly the way it's written. Where we tend to hit the gray areas between Baroque music and classical music. The pedal didn't really exist during that time, and if it did, it was on a very specialized instrument in somebody's house somewhere, or in a court of a king. So in general, I use pedal very sparingly because of that reason. Given that we are performing these pieces on a modern day instrument, we do want to take advantage of when we can use the pedal for more resonance, especially on a rolled chord. Back then, they would roll chords or they would have perpetual motion because that was their only way of sustaining the sound. If you're dealing with a harpsichord that's plucking, the sound only lasts as long as the pluck does. In general, I do not pedal, for instance, this Prelude and Fugue in C minor by Bach. I would never... I know there's some romantic interpretations of it where it's just fast and furious and blurry. I like to hear all the notes. All the harmonic changes by just giving a little accent on the first beat of each measure. If you're really careful, you might add just a tiny bit of pedal with those accents. Is it necessary? No. But when you get over to the second part of this prelude, and whenever we get into something that sounds like, oftentimes piano's trying to sound like other instruments, particularly the voice, and when we get into sections that sound like a cadenza or a recitative, if you're thinking in terms of opera, then we need to use a little pedal. For instance, like in the adagio section here. We can use a little pedal to add resonance to that chord. And then take it off. Again, I used a little pedal. Connected by fingering, if it can be connected by your hand, you should never have the foot do what the hand is supposed to be doing. So it's great if it adds a little color, but students get caught in the trap of using the pedal to connect instead of using proper fingering. So it's really important, especially a good example of this is the allegro that follows the adagio here. The left hand can hold the C and the B just fine. We don't need pedal there to do that. So same thing here. In the middle of this first movement, there's places where, you know, if you have a good addition, it might suggest some pedaling, but I always tell the students that those are suggestions, those aren't necessarily written by the composer. That's written by an editor who hopefully knew something about music history and piano evolution. In measure 91, that's a really good example where we have some octaves, because if we don't pedal here, it sounds a little choppy or disconnected. So. Now, here I'm not holding any pedal down. I'm doing it all with my hand until I have to play. And I'm going to just connect it to this. A little pedal for resonance. Just using the pedal for color mostly. And in that stormier section, the pedal also, because it causes so many more vibrations with all the sympathetic strings vibrating, it adds, when I say resonance, more volume too to the sound. So that's a spot in classical music when we have big rolled chords or octaves or something that we can't physically connect, or we want a little more oomph in the sound. There are a couple spots in this first movement where there are little cadenzas like that where you can use it. And they almost sound Baroque in style. This would be a very early classical sonata. So they're sounding pretty Baroque. The second movement in particular sounds like Baroque recitative. And oftentimes in music, piano is trying to emulate other instruments. In this case, the voice or maybe a soloist. Very, very tricky opening for a lot of students. It's the first time they've ever met this type of recitative in piano music. It happens all the time, especially with Mozart. Mozart loved opera. A lot of his pieces sound operatic in nature. But Haydn in particular is very much hearkening back to a Baroque recitative here. And the piano is trying to emulate what the continuo would sound like. And the soloist. Also continuo and the soloist. Don't let the foot do what the hands are supposed to be doing. So there, especially in this opening of this piece, there's a lot of places like that. So that's a very stylistic thing. Anything that's very Baroque, particularly slow movements that are emulating the voice or recitative. I always tell my students that's a good rule of thumb.